January 1942, Philadelphia Navy Yard. If you were standing there at dawn, you'd see the sky turning this deep orange color, cut through with smoke and steam rising from everywhere. Men in coats covered with oil stains are welding metal, and every time they do, sparks just shower down from the scaffolds above. The cranes are making these groaning sounds as they lift massive pieces of steel, and the riveters won't stop hammering. There's a foreman somewhere in all this noise, trying to shout orders loud enough for anyone to hear him. It's complete chaos. But here's the thing. In just 90 days, all of this mess is going to turn into a full aircraft carrier. When Japan's naval commanders eventually found out how fast America could build these things, they were absolutely stunned. This is that story, and honestly, it's one of the most incredible industrial achievements of the entire war. So stick around, because what happened here changed everything. But to understand why this moment mattered so much, we need to go back just a few weeks. December 7th, 1941. It was a Sunday morning, quiet and peaceful, until suddenly it wasn't. Japanese aircraft came roaring over Pearl Harbor, and in less than 2 hours, they'd left the U.S. Pacific Fleet in ruins. Battleships were capsized, airfields were burning, and that comfortable feeling Americans had, that sense of being far away and protected by two oceans, it was just gone. People were stunned. They were angry. But underneath all that shock and grief, something else was waking up. This massive industrial power that had been sitting dormant was starting to stir. Japan's admirals thought they'd bought themselves at least 6 months where nobody could touch them in the Pacific. They'd done the math on America's production capabilities and figured it would take years for the U.S. to recover from Pearl Harbor. And you know what? For a while, they were absolutely right. The Navy had lost most of its heavy ships, and the only things left that could really hit back were carriers. These relatively new vessels that were just starting to prove themselves in modern warfare. Problem was, there weren't nearly enough of them. By early 1942, Japan's empire had spread across half an ocean. The Philippines fell, Singapore fell, Guam, the Dutch East Indies. One after another, these places were being swallowed up. Every victory cut deeper into Allied supply lines, and American bases kept falling like dominoes. If you opened a newspaper back then, the headlines all said pretty much the same thing. The Pacific was lost. In Washington, President Roosevelt pulled together his military chiefs and the country's top industrial leaders. His message was straightforward. We have to outbuild them. He got it. This war wasn't just going to be won or lost out on the water. It was going to be decided in factories, in shipyards, in foundries, all across America. The real battle was about production, about who could replace their losses faster than the other guy. The Navy's planners were staring at some really harsh numbers. Japan had more than a dozen carriers operating. America? Barely 7, and some of those were damaged. Even if they approved new ships right then, building a fleet carrier typically took over 2 years. And America didn't have 2 years. The Pacific was burning right now, not 2 years from now. Every shipyard from Norfolk to San Francisco was looking at what felt like an impossible task. There weren't enough steel supplies, not enough workers, and the bureaucracy was tying everything up in knots. But even while ships were still smoldering in Hawaii, telegrams started going out across the country. They were calling back engineers, welders, designers, draftsmen, anyone with skills. This nation that had built massive skyscrapers and sprawling railroad networks and revolutionized the automobile was about to turn all that talent toward one thing: war. The transformation happened fast. Factories that used to make washing machines started forging aircraft engines instead. Down in Detroit, those automobile assembly lines, they were suddenly churning out tanks and B-24 bombers. Every American city with a river or a port became a construction zone overnight. But the heaviest pressure, the most critical work, was happening in the Navy's shipyards, because everyone knew the carriers would decide what happened in the Pacific. So in January 1942, the Navy's Bureau of Ships started holding these emergency meetings. The whole agenda was about one question: how do we get new carriers to sea, and how do we do it fast? Admiral Ernest King was running things, and if you knew anything about him, you knew he had a temper and impossibly high standards. His message to everyone was blunt: we don't have time for perfection. We need ships that can fight. That single directive kicked off one of the biggest industrial gambles in history. The naval architects stopped staring at empty blueprints and started looking at what they already had. Sitting in dry docks across the country were these half-finished Cleveland-class cruisers. Smaller, faster ships that were supposed to be used for traditional surface combat. But someone asked the question, what if we converted them? What if instead of waiting years for brand-new fleet carriers, we took these cruiser hulls and transformed them into light carriers that could launch aircraft within months? It was a bold idea, maybe even a desperate one, but the logic made sense. The cruiser hulls were already there. The engines were installed. The basic structure was solid, with some reinforced decks, redesigned hangars, and a modular approach to assembly. They could create a whole new type of carrier, the Independence class, America's answer when the clock was running out. By February, the Navy had given the green light. Shipyards in Philadelphia, Quincy, and Camden got urgent telegrams stamped top priority. They were building the first prototype immediately. Engineers worked through the night under floodlights, redrafting plans and reworking entire sections of the ships. The transformation from cruiser to carrier was actually happening. Across the Pacific, Japanese naval intelligence picked up bits and pieces of American radio chatter about new ships under construction. The reports seemed ridiculous to them. 90 days? No way. Even Japan's most efficient yards needed over a year to finish a carrier. Senior officers in Tokyo wrote it off as propaganda, just Americans trying to boost morale. They were wrong. Dangerously wrong. Because what started as this desperate experiment was quickly turning into something much bigger, a complete industrial revolution happening under wartime pressure. The Pacific was still burning, sure, but in the clang of steel hitting steel, in the hum of those massive cranes, in the rhythm of factories running day and night across America, a new sound was building. It was the sound of a nation rebuilding its fleet from the ashes. And, pretty soon, that sound was going to be a lot louder than any explosion Japan could deliver. Now, taking an idea and actually making it work are two completely different things. In the Bureau of Ships' war room, there were these blueprints spread out across this long oak table. Pages and pages covered in hand-drawn grids, measurements, notes scribbled in the margins. Every single pencil mark on those papers represented how urgent this whole thing was. They'd come up with this improvised plan to convert cruisers into carriers, but now it had to become real. Actual steel, actual rivets, actual engines that could take you across an ocean. The whole plan revolved around these Cleveland-class hulls that were already being built. Each one was about 610 feet long, powered by 4 turbines that could push the ship past 30 knots. What made them perfect was they were narrow and fast. The engineers figured out that if they widened the upper decks and reinforced the frames, they could slap a shortened flight deck on top that could handle fighters and torpedo planes. In theory, these things could launch aircraft faster than a lot of full-sized carriers, and they'd cost a fraction of the price and take way less time to build. They approved the new design in February 1942. The WWII ships got reclassified as light carriers, CVLs, and they became the Independence class. It was basically naval triage, taking what you've got and turning it into what you desperately need. Every shipyard got the same order: finish the conversion in record time. The New York Shipbuilding Corporation down in Camden, New Jersey, took point on this. The scale of it was just staggering. They had this hull, CL-59, originally supposed to be a cruiser called Amsterdam, and that became the template for everything. More than 3,000 workers flooded the docks, working around the clock. They were welding new decks, installing arrestor wires, completely transforming the cruiser's superstructure into this island tower that could actually handle carrier operations. Eventually, they christened that ship USS Independence, and it became the namesake for the whole class. The pace of the work was borderline insane, but they had a secret weapon: prefabrication. Instead of building the ship piece by piece in one spot, they were manufacturing thousands of components at different locations: elevator assemblies, bulkhead sections, hangar frames, all built off-site and delivered by rail. Workers would just fit them together like puzzle pieces. It was the same assembly line philosophy that built cars, except now they were building aircraft carriers. The numbers really tell you everything you need to know. A traditional Essex-class fleet carrier took over 2 years to finish. The first Independence-class prototype, ready in less than 6 months, and the ones after that, under 3 months. America was literally rewriting the math of warfare. By March 1942, word about this radical approach was spreading through Washington. Some of the naval officers weren't having it. They said light carriers would be too small, too fragile, couldn't sustain heavy operations. Admiral King shut them down. He told his staff, "The perfect ship is the one that arrives first." That was it. Speed over perfection. No more arguments. In Philadelphia, Newport News, Camden, that philosophy turned into pure motion. New cranes started appearing against the skyline. The air smelled like cut steel constantly. You had women welders with their hair tied up in kerchiefs, working right alongside men who used to build passenger liners. Every single rivet they drove into those hulls carried the memory of Pearl Harbor with it. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Japanese intelligence officers were getting confused reports. American radio intercepts kept mentioning multiple carrier hulls underway. Tokyo's analysts didn't believe it. Their own shipyards were barely keeping up with maintaining what they already had. The idea that new carriers could be popping up every few months, it just didn't make sense to them. Japan still saw the United States as this industrial dinosaur. Powerful, yeah, but slow. They hadn't realized yet that they were watching a democratic economy transform itself into a wartime machine. By May, the first Independence-class ship was already launched from dry dock. Then others started following fast. Belleau Wood, Cowpens, Monterey, Cabot, Langley, Princeton. Each one rolled down the slipway to crowds cheering, bands playing, newspapers running headlines. The press called them victory ships. The workers just called them ours. With every new vessel, they learned something from the one before. Better wiring systems, more efficient catapult mechanisms, stronger deck plating. Each improvement shaved hours off the next build. The whole production process started feeding on itself, getting faster and faster. That 90-day target that sounded like propaganda at first, it was actually achievable now, but here's the thing. This miracle wasn't just about the machines and the engineering, it was about people. Behind every blueprint was a real person. Draftsmen bent over tables until the sun came up. Machinists sleeping on benches between shifts because they couldn't go home. Young women writing letters to their families about welding decks instead of typing memos. Their photographs ended up lining the mess halls. Their signatures were scrawled inside the bulkhead panels, where nobody would ever see them except the ship itself. By summer of 1942, you could see the Pacific War starting to change shape. The U.S. Navy had new teeth. These light carriers, smaller but faster, started joining task forces right alongside the bigger Essex-class ships. They could carry around 30 aircraft, fighters, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, enough firepower to project real power way beyond what their size suggested. Each one was basically a message to Tokyo. You can sink our fleet on a Sunday morning, and we'll have a new one ready by spring. While Japanese admirals were still debating whether any of this was even possible, American shipyards were already working on their next miracle, pushing speed, coordination, and manpower beyond anything that had ever been done before. Because by 1942, the question wasn't if America could build a carrier in 90 days anymore. The only question that mattered was how many they could build. Every war has its front lines. Some are fought with bullets, others with blueprints. For the United States in 1942, the most decisive battles weren't happening on coral islands or open seas. They were happening inside the shipyards. The industrial front became the beating heart of everything. Cities like Camden, Philadelphia, Newport News, San Francisco, they throbbed with sound. Hammers on metal, cranes groaning under weight, whistles marking the end of shifts that never really ended. The people filling those yards weren't soldiers, but they carried the same urgency. Every weld, every bolt, every measurement. They knew it could mean lives saved or lost thousands of miles away. And among them stood someone new. Women. Lots of them. Rosie the Riveter wasn't some propaganda poster you glanced at and forgot. She was real. She was everywhere. Housewives, secretaries, teachers, students. They swapped aprons for overalls and learned to weld, rivet, read ship diagrams. In Camden alone, nearly 3,000 women joined the workforce by mid-1943. Most had never held a wrench before, but within weeks, they were sealing bulkheads and aligning flight deck panels with the kind of precision that made naval inspectors do a double-take. They worked under floodlights that burned through the night. 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. Some slept in boarding houses nearby, others right there on site, too exhausted to make it home. They sang while they worked, folk tunes, radio hits, whatever drowned out the machinery. To them, this wasn't just a job. It was personal. Every spark from a welder's torch felt like a small answer to Pearl Harbor. But patriotism alone doesn't build a fleet. You need organization, systems. And America's industrialists? They rewrote the rulebook. Henry Kaiser's shipyards on the West Coast had already pioneered this thing called modular assembly for Liberty ships, finishing entire cargo vessels in under 2 weeks. The Navy looked at that and said, "We can do better." Prefabrication became the way forward. Whole deck segments built in factories inland, then shipped by rail to coastal yards. A flight deck section made in Detroit could arrive in Camden, get lifted by crane, and be welded into place within hours. It was industrial choreography on a national scale. Every train car, every shipment of steel, every barrel of oil, all of it had to arrive on time. The Office of War Production coordinated it with near-military precision. Schedules looked like battle plans. Delays were treated like tactical failures. But the system only worked because of the people inside it. Engineers would tell you stories about workers who pushed past exhaustion. "They wouldn't leave," one supervisor wrote. You'd blow the whistle for shift change, and half of them just kept welding. When someone asked a young woman from New Jersey why she stayed, she didn't even hesitate. "Because my brother's out there somewhere." The pride was real. When the USS Independence finally left dry dock, workers cried. Newspapers called it a victory before it even fired a shot. Across the shipyards, banners started appearing. Built with American hands. But behind all that emotion was innovation. Quiet, relentless technical progress. Traditional riveting gave way to arc welding, cutting months off build times and producing stronger seams. New cranes, some 300 feet tall, moved prefabricated sections weighing hundreds of tons with centimeter precision. Engineers standardized hull fittings and machinery layouts so that one yard's part could fit perfectly in another's ship. Before 1942, that was unheard of. The shipyard became something alive, self-correcting, adaptive, learning. When Camden faced a shortage of trained welders, retired machinists came out of retirement to teach the new recruits. When steel shortages hit, factories pivoted overnight from civilian products to naval supply. Even high schools started pre-apprentice programs, preparing teenagers to join the yards by the time they graduated. And somehow, through all of it, morale stayed high. The war brought hardship, rationing, blackouts, telegrams nobody wanted to receive. But it also brought unity. In the canteens, workers ate beside naval officers from metal trays. Class differences? Background? None of that mattered under the roar of the furnaces. The enemy had bombed America's fleet, sure. But in doing that, they'd awakened something they couldn't measure. A collective determination to rebuild faster than anyone thought humanly possible. By mid-1943, America's industrial miracle had literally reshaped the country. Entire towns grew around shipyards, cafes, post offices, schools. They all followed the rhythm of those whistles. Kids knew the names of the ships their parents were building. You see photographs of them holding small wooden models of the WW2 and Cowpens, looking as proud as if they were launching the real things themselves. But optimism doesn't tell the whole story. Behind it was exhaustion, risk. The rush to meet deadlines pushed safety to the edge. Fires broke out. Scaffolds collapsed. And still, the work never stopped. Production wasn't just a goal, it was survival. The war couldn't wait. Each completed ship carried a signature, literally. Workers carved initials behind panels or welded small metal plaques with their names. They'd never set foot on those carriers, but a part of them would sail across the Pacific anyway. When Japanese intelligence finally confirmed that multiple new American carriers were showing up in 1943, disbelief turned to alarm. Reports described smaller, faster vessels of unusual design. Analysts in Tokyo couldn't explain how such ships appeared so quickly. They didn't know what they were really seeing. It wasn't just steel and machinery. It was millions of hours of labor, discipline, sacrifice, all of it condensed into 90 days. For Japan, it was confusion. For America, confirmation. The industrial front had won its first great victory. And yet, as every new hull slipped into the water, one truth became impossible to ignore. Behind every miracle of steel stood leadership, unseen but decisive, guiding the storm of production with an iron hand. Leadership in wartime production is rarely glamorous. There are no medals for cutting through bureaucracy, no parades for paperwork signed at midnight. But the miracle of the 90-day carrier, it was as much a triumph of management as it was of manpower. At its helm stood one man, Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet and Chief of Naval Operations, a man known equally for brilliance and brutality. King was feared even within the Navy. He had little patience for delay and even less for excuses. His presence alone carried an unspoken law. Efficiency was patriotism. Under his direction, the Navy Bureau of Ships became an engine of controlled chaos. Deadlines stacked on deadlines. Thousands of telegrams flying daily between Washington and the yards. Each message carried the same tone. Deliver sooner. King understood something most people didn't. That the war in the Pacific wouldn't be won by individual heroics. It would be won by output. Battles happened at sea, sure, but victories were forged in dockyards. He empowered engineers, broke through procurement barriers, demanded real-time coordination between design offices and manufacturers. Don't design for perfection, he told the Bureau. Design for production. That directive unlocked a technological revolution. The old way of shipbuilding, slow, sequential, bespoke, got replaced by modular, simultaneous construction. Instead of building a hull from keel upward, different sections were fabricated in parallel. One team built the stern while another assembled the flight deck. Welders worked while electricians installed wiring. Painters followed immediately behind. It was a ballet of coordination, where timing was absolutely everything. The Navy's engineers also rethought what it meant to build fast. Welding replaced riveting, a to A shift that didn't just strengthen seams but saved months. New automatic welding machines, guided by templates, could complete joints that once took teams of men days to finish. Portable electric tools meant work could continue regardless of weather or daylight. Floodlights kept the yards glowing through the night, as if the sun itself refused to set until the job was done. Technology didn't stop at tools. It extended to materials. America's steel mills produced uniform plates to exact specifications, making parts interchangeable across multiple shipyards. The Independence-class design was standardized to the inch. Any component built in one city could fit perfectly into a hull halfway across the country. This wasn't coincidence, it was planning, the kind of precision that only a united industrial system could pull off. King's style was often called dictatorial, but his methods worked. He surrounded himself with problem solvers like Rear Admiral Samuel M. Robinson, the director of the Bureau of Ships. Robinson's engineers coordinated with civilian industrial leaders, the presidents of Bethlehem Steel, New York Shipbuilding, Newport News. Together they formed this unspoken alliance between the Navy and American business. The result wasn't just cooperation, it was fusion. While the United States built faster than ever, Japan could only watch. Tokyo's naval attachés, stationed in Berlin and Lisbon, sent coded reports back to the Imperial Navy's general staff. They spoke of massive industrial mobilization and carrier-type vessels emerging at unprecedented rates. 1. Japanese intelligence officer wrote bitterly, "Their shipyards work as if possessed by demons." Within Japan's war ministry, disbelief turned to anxiety. Their own shipyards were straining under relentless bombing and supply shortages. Each Japanese carrier required meticulous craftsmanship, hand-fitted steel, individually forged components. What had once been a symbol of pride now became a liability. While Japan's naval artisans built masterpieces, America built armadas, and yet speed didn't mean fragility. The Independence-class carriers proved remarkably sturdy. Tests showed they could withstand severe stress, high-speed maneuvers, rough seas. Each carried around 30 aircraft, enough to serve as the strike spear of fast task groups. In combat, they would soon prove that quantity and efficiency could coexist with power. By 1943, the first of these ships reached active service. The USS Belleau Wood joined the Pacific Fleet and launched aircraft during raids on the Gilbert Islands. Japanese observers were stunned. How could such a vessel, unlisted in pre-war assessments, appear so soon? They combed through reconnaissance photos, searching for clues. To them, it defied logic. To America, it was the natural outcome of a system that had learned to think in weeks instead of years. While Japan guarded its shipyards like sacred ground, America treated them like laboratories, places to test, adjust, innovate. Every new hull produced data. Every delay produced a solution. Engineers learned to anticipate failures before they happened. It was industrial evolution, faster, smarter, unstoppable. Even Roosevelt took notice. Visiting a shipyard in late 1942, he remarked, "This is not just production, it's creation." For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the president's words carried confidence rather than defiance. The momentum was irreversible. The Independence-class experiment had proven more than a point. It had rewritten the rules of naval construction. Behind every welding arc and crane lift was a doctrine born not of tradition, but necessity. Build fast, build strong, build again. And as the first 90-day ships steamed toward the Pacific, the men who had overseen their birth knew what awaited. These carriers weren't just weapons. They were statements, proof that a free nation, when pushed to the edge, could match the discipline of empires and surpass it with imagination. The leadership had set the rhythm. The technology had provided the means. And now, the ocean would bear witness to what those 90 days had created. By the spring of 1943, the impossible had become routine. Steel that once took years to shape now became a warship in weeks. In the New York shipbuilding yard at Camden, a quiet competition was brewing. Foremen whispering goals, welders boasting about record times, supervisors daring each other to go faster without sacrificing precision. What they were building would soon make history. A light carrier completed, fitted, and ready for combat in just 90 days. The chosen vessel was hull number CVL-24, the USS WW2. She began life not as a carrier, but as a Cleveland-class cruiser hull. Her keel had barely cooled before the plans were redrawn, her purpose redefined. The Navy ordered her conversion into a light carrier, one of 9 Independence-class ships that would bridge the gap between the early war's desperation and America's coming dominance. Day 1. A bell rang through the yard at dawn, echoing off cranes and catwalks. Workers streamed through the gates, lunch pails in hand, boots slick with rain and oil. They didn't yet know they were about to set a record. Every hour counted. The process resembled surgery, fast, precise, relentless. Sections of prefabricated flight deck arrived by rail, each marked for its destination. Massive cranes hoisted them into place as teams below guided them with gloved hands. Sparks flew in showers of orange light. The scent of hot steel hung in the air. Supervisors tracked progress with chalk marks on a giant wall chart. Each square represented a day. Each X meant another stage completed. Hull plating, island structure, elevator installation, power plant testing. When a delay occurred, the engineers didn't wait for authorization. They solved it on the spot. Speed was the only rule. By day 30, the skeleton of a carrier towered above the river. The deck took shape, rising higher each night under floodlights that turned the yard into a glowing furnace visible for miles. Reporters who visited called it organized chaos. Day 45. The shipyard whistles blew, half in triumph, half in disbelief. The WW2's hull was complete. Workers moved on to her internals: engines, hangars, fuel lines, ammunition lifts. Technicians from General Electric arrived with generators still warm from the factory floor. Electricians installed wiring while carpenters built crew quarters behind them. There was no waiting. Everything moved simultaneously, as though time itself had been forced to cooperate. By day 60, the shipyard's public relations office couldn't keep the story quiet anymore. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran a small headline: "New American carrier nears completion in record time." The article didn't exaggerate. WW2 was already painted, wired, armed. Her flight deck gleamed beneath spring sunlight, marked with fresh white stripes. Her island structure, compact and efficient, stood ready for radar and communications gear. In Tokyo, the news seemed absurd. Japanese analysts reviewing intercepted broadcasts dismissed the claim outright. 90 days? Impossible. Even Japan's Shokaku-class carriers had required over a year. Their construction philosophy valued precision and tradition, a reflection of the nation's craftsman culture. To them, a ship completed in 3 months wasn't an achievement. It was an insult to naval engineering. They would soon learn otherwise. Day 83, the WW2 floated free. Crowds lining the dock waved flags, sang songs, cheered as the great hull slid into the Delaware River. Her bow sliced through the current as her name was revealed in white letters along the stern. Among the onlookers were factory workers, school children, families of sailors lost at Pearl Harbor. The launch wasn't just a mechanical event. It was emotional redemption. A Navy photographer captured the moment. A black and white image showing the ship half submerged, cranes towering behind her, steam rolling from her funnels. That photograph would appear on posters across the nation under a single headline: "Built in 90 days." But her story didn't end at launch. Belleau Wood's trials began almost immediately. Within weeks, she steamed out of Philadelphia, her engines still smelling of paint and metal. Her crew, most of them teenagers from Kansas, Iowa, New York, trained on deck as welders below finished last-minute fittings. There was no downtime. By summer, she was en route to the Pacific. Her first test came during Operation Galvanic, the invasion of the Gilbert Islands. Operating with Task Group 50.3, Belleau Wood launched dozens of sorties against Japanese airfields and shipping. Her planes struck with precision, clearing the skies over Tarawa and Makin. The Japanese defenders, accustomed to small numbers of enemy aircraft, were overwhelmed. From the first strike to the last, the ship performed flawlessly. Reports from U.S. naval intelligence soon reached Washington. The new light carriers were proving faster to deploy, easier to maneuver, devastatingly effective when paired in groups. They filled the gaps the larger Essex-class carriers couldn't reach. The experiment had succeeded. In Tokyo, panic spread quietly through the naval staff. Intercepted transmissions confirmed the presence of new carrier types operating across the Central Pacific. At first, they assumed these were earlier vessels repaired and renamed. But reconnaissance photos told another story. These ships were smaller, sleeker, too numerous to be explained. One officer in the Imperial Navy's Technical Bureau wrote, "The Americans appear to have discovered a way to grow carriers like mushrooms." By early 1944, Belleau Wood joined the assault on the Marianas, launching airstrikes that crippled Japan's remaining naval air power. She fought through typhoons, kamikaze attacks, long nights at general quarters. Her decks, once welded in a frantic race against time, now served as the front line of a new American strategy: mobility through numbers. Every rivet, every weld, every decision made under Admiral King's brutal timeline had led to this: a fleet that no longer feared attrition. America could lose ships and replace them faster than Japan could count them. The 90-day miracle had become doctrine. When the Battle of Leyte Gulf erupted in late 1944, Belleau Wood was there again, her aircraft hammering Japanese ships retreating through the Sibuyan Sea. One of her pilots, Lieutenant Donald Gordon, shot down 5 enemy aircraft in a single day. For his actions, he became an ace, a living link between the shipbuilders at home and the warriors at sea. Japan had once believed time was on their side. Now, they were running out of it. As Belleau Wood steamed into port for refueling, reporters gathered on the pier. One asked her captain what made the difference, what allowed a ship built in 3 months to perform like a veteran. The captain smiled and answered quietly, "It's not how long you build her, it's how much you believe she's needed." That belief, shared by every welder, engineer, and pilot, was America's real secret weapon. The 90-day miracle was no longer a headline. It was now a fleet, living, sailing proof that industry, when driven by necessity and faith, could defy the limits of time itself. And for Japan's admirals watching from across the Pacific, disbelief had finally turned into dread. By the end of 1944, the balance of the Pacific had shifted completely. What began as a desperate race against time had become an unstoppable rhythm. American carriers, big and small, filled the ocean horizon like an iron tide. From the Independence to the Belleau Wood, from the Langley to the Cabot, each new hull carried not just aircraft, but proof of something larger, that industrial speed could become a weapon as lethal as any bomb. The numbers were staggering. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States commissioned more than 100 aircraft carriers, a scale no other nation in history had ever approached. Japan, by comparison, managed only a handful. Each American ship that slid into the water represented thousands of jobs, tons of material, Hundreds of lives saved on the front lines. The strategy was simple: replace faster than the enemy could destroy. The Independence-class light carriers, once considered a temporary measure, proved so effective they became a permanent feature of naval doctrine. Their speed allowed them to escort larger carrier groups, provide air cover during amphibious assaults, launch surprise raids deep into enemy territory. They could operate close to islands where deep-draft fleet carriers dared not go. The concept of flexible response, using smaller, faster carriers in coordination with larger ones, was born here, forged in urgency and refined in battle. In every report reaching Washington, the same conclusion appeared: the experiment had succeeded beyond expectation. Admiral King, famously unsentimental, wrote a rare note of satisfaction in late 1944. The CVLs have more than justified their existence. Their performance exceeds what paper predicted. The Japanese High Command, meanwhile, was unraveling. Intelligence officers couldn't accurately estimate American naval strength anymore. For every carrier sunk, two more seemed to appear. The psychological toll was immense. A captured Japanese officer later told his interrogators, "It was like fighting the ocean itself, endless, formless, always returning." Behind the front lines, the American home front glowed with a different kind of victory. At the Camden Yard, where WW2 had been born, production crews gathered as news of her combat success spread. Workers who had once welded her decks now saw her name in newspaper headlines and newsreel footage. To them, it felt personal. The letters they had carved behind her bulkheads, initials, birth dates, prayers, were sailing through Pacific storms. They had built more than a ship. They had built connection. The same scene repeated in shipyards across the country. In Quincy, Massachusetts, a worker's family watched footage of the USS Cabot launching aircraft in the Philippines and recognized a marking they had painted on a supply crate months before. In Philadelphia, engineers followed the performance reports of the USS Princeton until her tragic loss at Leyte, not with despair, but with determination to build the next one better. The industrial engine didn't stop when the war turned favorable. Instead, it accelerated. Every lesson learned on one carrier fed into the next. Design improvements, simplified wiring systems, faster loading cranes. Each advancement shaved hours, then days, from production. The final Independence-class ships were completed in less than 3 months, breaking even the original 90-day goal. As the tide of war turned toward Japan's homeland, America's new doctrine of quantity through quality became absolute. By 1945, U.S. carrier groups dominated every major naval engagement. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey, saw hundreds of Japanese aircraft destroyed, many by planes launched from light carriers like the WW2 and Langley Wen. News of the victory reached the shipyards. Workers paused for the first time in months. There was no cheering, no parades, just quiet satisfaction. The ships had done their part. The war was turning, and the men and women who had built the tools of victory understood their place in history. In the months that followed Japan's surrender, many of those shipyards fell silent. Cranes stood still. Floodlights dimmed. The workers went home, some to farms, others to families they hadn't seen in years. The world they had built, a world of urgency, purpose, unity, faded back into peacetime normalcy. But its impact endured. The Independence-class carriers continued to serve for decades. Some participated in Korea, others as training or auxiliary vessels. Their design principles influenced the next generation of carriers, including the post-war Essex and Forrestal classes. But beyond the steel, their true legacy was philosophical, the understanding that adaptability could win wars. For Japan, the lesson came with devastating clarity. Their shipyards, once symbols of precision and craftsmanship, had been outpaced by America's industrial fluidity. Japan's naval doctrine, rigid, hierarchical, tradition-bound, couldn't survive against a system that reinvented itself every month. When the war ended, the ruins of Kure and Yokosuka stood as monuments not just to defeat, but to an outdated way of thinking. In Washington, the Navy's final wartime reports summarized the transformation succinctly. The United States Navy entered this war with 6 carriers. It ended it with 95. The line carried no boast, only awe. And somewhere in those statistics, among the rows of tonnage and timelines, lay the story of one ship, a carrier born in 90 days, from sketches to sea, built by hands that refused to rest. The USS Belleau Wood would fight bravely until war's end, surviving multiple battles and even a direct kamikaze hit in October 1944. Her decks burned, her aircraft destroyed, yet she limped back to port, repaired, refitted, returned to combat in weeks. Even damaged, she embodied the spirit that had created her. Fast recovery, relentless will. When the war finally ended, she carried American aircraft during the occupation of Japan. The same steel that had once been shaped to avenge Pearl Harbor now floated peacefully in Tokyo Bay, her deck lined with sailors watching the sun rise over a defeated empire. That image, ATT, ship built in 3 months, standing in the harbor of Japan, became the closing chapter of an era. The miracle of the 90 days had come full circle. And as America dismantled its wartime machinery, historians and engineers alike understood what had truly been built. Not just ships, but a blueprint for modern power, the unity of democracy, industry, and will. The sparks that once flew over the Delaware River had lit more than a shipyard. They had lit the path to victory. When the fires of war cooled and the Pacific grew quiet again, America looked back on its victory with a mix of pride and disbelief. The numbers still felt unreal. Carriers built in months, planes produced by the thousands, a nation that had turned from peace to total war and back again in less than 4 years. Yet beneath those figures lay a truth far greater than statistics. The 90-day carrier was never just a ship. It was a statement, proof that when free people are driven by necessity, coordination, and belief, they can achieve what empires deem impossible. Japan's admirals, trained in the traditions of craft and patience, couldn't understand how democracy could organize so completely, so fast. But that was the paradox of freedom. When it's threatened, it unites. In every rivet of the Belleau Wood, in every weld of the Independence, there lived a lesson about what happens when ordinary citizens take ownership of a nation's survival. They didn't wait for orders. They built, they adapted, they out-imagined the enemy. That spirit, not the steel, became America's greatest weapon. Admiral King once said, "Wars are won by logistics." He was right. But logistics aren't machines or charts. They're people, millions of them, aligning their skills toward one goal. The men and women who labored in those shipyards never stood on a battlefield. Yet their fingerprints shaped the outcome as surely as any pilot or sailor. When the USS Belleau Wood sailed through Tokyo Bay at war's end, the same empire that had doubted her very existence watched her glide past in silence. 90 days of construction had carried her through 3 years of battle and across an ocean of history. Today, her story stands as a monument not just to speed, but to belief, the belief that a free nation, tested by fire, can build faster than fear can spread. In 90 days, America built more than a carrier. It built confidence, it built unity, it built proof that liberty, when fully awakened, can outproduce tyranny itself. And that, more than any weapon or victory, became the true legacy of the 90-day miracle.